Brian Welker couldn't help but smile, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Earlier that day, he had been promoted to shift foreman at Harding Containers, effective immediately. To top it all off, he was given the opportunity to work the night shift for the foreseeable future. Most people hate night shifts, but for Brian, it was a very good time. His son was a junior in high school. He played several sports and attended clubs. By working nights, Brian could attend his son's classes without missing work. He had worked the night shift many times over the years and had developed a bedtime system that made it all work out for him. It was the reason he was crawling along the roof rafters in his attic on a warm August afternoon. After he had been informed of his promotion, he had been given paid days off on Thursday and Friday. It was an opportunity to rest and prepare for his new position, which would start Sunday night. Brian had long planned to make a small apartment over his detached garage. It would become his fortress of solitude where he could peacefully shorten his days. He hoped to avoid the usual disturbances and distractions that so often occur when one tries to fall asleep at a time when most people are up. Brian was laying cable to get internet in his apartment. The Wi-Fi signal in the house just wasn't reaching the apartment. He decided to install an extension cord at the end of the attic of the house, closer to the garage, in the hope that it would provide a strong signal to the apartment. Uncoiling the wire along the length of the attic, Brian heard faint sounds coming from inside the house. It was early morning, so his wife Brenda was at work. Tim, their son, was visiting Brenda's parents for a few days, so the house must have been empty. Brian crawled across the trusses to where the sounds were coming from. Moving 15 feet closer, Brian was able to identify the source of the sounds. It was his bedroom. The conversation became clearer as Brian settled over an unused vent in the ceiling of their bedroom. Brenda insisted that the old vent was blowing cold air on her at night, causing her neck to hurt frequently. He installed a new vent as far away from Brenda's bed as possible, but never bothered to remove the old one. That would have required patching the hole in the ceiling created by pulling the vent. Brian just left it on the ceiling but didn't attach it to any ductwork. He carefully lifted the fiberglass insulation that lay on the attic floor and slowly opened the vent. He felt his gut tighten as he saw his wife of 20 years moving beneath the skinny man. As painful as the sight was, Brian couldn't look away. He couldn't stop watching the train wreck that had once been his marriage. The couple had been screwing for several minutes when Brian's brain finally started working. He set the phone to video and carefully placed it on the vent so that the camera's eye would have an unobstructed view of the marital bed. Brian recognized the man. It was Bill Grant, a driver for the package delivery company where both he and Brenda worked. He was recently divorced and had a daughter in Tim's class. "That sounds awful," Brenda replied, but without any emotion. "You wanted to have sex in my bed because the thought of being outdone by Brian turns you on? You act like it's a competition or something." "It's a competition, at least for men," Grant replied with a soft chuckle. "You're a sexy woman and the sex we have is great. But the realization that you're married and I'm having sex with you in your husband's bed makes me the winner. It won't be so great if Brian catches us here. I don't know why I agreed to this, but it won't happen again. I'm worried about Brian discovering us. It would ruin my marriage," Brenda admitted. "Let's make a deal," Grant suggested. "If you turn your husband off, I won't insist that we do it in his bed. Once he's back between your legs, we'll have to go back so I can reclaim my place as top dog. I'm not going to say no to Brian. He's my husband. I can't just close my legs and expect him to say yes," Brenda reasoned. "He's a man and he wants sex on a regular basis." "Do what you gotta do," said the guy. "I'm going to try to talk Brian out of sex and keep these suicidal encounters in my bedroom to a minimum. I hate to think about what would happen if Brian ever caught us." Brian parked his truck in a detached garage. It was hidden from view, so Brenda didn't know he was home and certainly didn't suspect he was eavesdropping on her conversation. His face was covered in sweat. Sweat dripped off his body onto the insulation covering the floor of the attic. He didn't allow himself to induce vomiting, knowing how hard it would be to clean himself up and how bad the whole attic would smell. He forced himself to hold still as he listened to the loving couple get dressed and leave. Making his way to the stairs, Brian pondered what he had just learned. The vile bastard was entertaining his wife. She was even going to deny him sex just to placate and please her lover. Brian held back a grim smile as he pondered this. Brenda would have no trouble refusing to have sex with him. Taking a shower, he surveyed the situation and quickly came to a few decisions. He would not let Brenda know that he knew about her infidelity. Tim still had 2 more years of school left, and Brian decided that his main focus would be on his son. He would no longer worry about Brenda. He just wasn't interested in what she wanted or how she felt anymore. Why did he have to worry about her since she clearly treated him with utter contempt? He didn't want to leave the house he'd spent 15 years remodeling so that some low-life jerk could live in it comfortably while entertaining his wife. Brenda didn't look like she was getting a divorce, so Brian decided to try to hold out until Tim graduated from high school. One thing he knew he would need, his apartment would be ready much sooner. Brian decided that he would include a few major upgrades to it. Instead of sleeping in it during night shifts, it would become his living space for the next 1.5 years. He would need a small kitchenette as well as a full bathroom. By the time Tim graduates from high school and heads off to college, Brian will have time to make a plan of how to proceed. To do this, Brian called several contractors he knew and made an appointment to get an estimate. He decided to hire a company to do the work. It would be done quickly and professionally, and he would pay someone to do it. There was no longer a need to save money by doing everything himself. His promotion would easily allow him to cover the cost. For the first time in his life, Brian realized that his time was more important than money. If he saves $1, half of it will belong to Brenda. He was done with his old way of life. He had always tried to do as much housework as possible, thinking it would benefit his family. That all changed when he saw Grant entertaining Brenda. He was going to make sure that Tim's college education was fully funded. Besides, Brian was going to rebuild his life and have fun while doing it. He no longer felt loyalty to his cheating wife. By the time Brenda walked in after work and saw him sitting in the kitchen, Brian had already gotten his emotions under control. "Are you home already? You got off early for some reason?" Brian looked at Brenda and decided she looked different. There were wrinkles on her face and a few extra pounds. Why hadn't he noticed this before? Had his love for his wife blinded him to her flaws? It made him sad to think about how his attitude toward Brenda had suddenly changed, but after all, it was her decision to have an affair. He was just reacting to it. "Yeah, we're in a bit of a jam at work. I've been asked to work nights starting tonight. They let me come home, pack a lunch, and rest. I'll be back later. They shouldn't ask you to work nights after the day shift, even if you had free time during the day," Brenda reasoned. "You'll be exhausted. At least lie down and sleep for a few hours." "Good idea," Brian replied. "I'll just get between the sheets and wait," Brenda said a little too loudly, remembering the condition of the bed. "I just remembered that I need to wash the linens." "Okay," Brian replied calmly, grimly chuckling at Brenda's discomfort. "I'll just use the bed in the guest room. You don't have to worry so much." A few hours later, Brian left the house like he was going to work. He went to the local sports bar, watched a baseball game, and drank a few beers. He had put an air mattress in his future apartment beforehand. After making sure Brenda was already asleep, he parked in the garage and walked up the stairs to the air mattress. He slept surprisingly well. One of the contractors Brian spoke with the next day was between projects and offered a very good price if Brian would agree to start work immediately. In 2 weeks, the contractor's crew was scheduled to move to a new facility a few miles away. Brian agreed and signed a contract that required work to begin Monday morning. His night shift worked from Sunday evening through Thursday evening. The plant would close on Friday night and start up again on Sunday night. Brenda knew that Brian wouldn't have to work Friday night, so she was surprised when he got ready for bed the next night and headed for the guest room. "Why are you going to sleep in the guest room? We won't see each other much while you're working the night shift. So why don't you sleep in our bed?" a perplexed Brenda asked. "Since I worked last night and slept for a few hours this morning while you were at work, I'm not really tired. I'm going to watch a baseball game and then maybe go to a movie afterwards," Brian replied with a planned excuse. "I'm trying to get used to being awake at night and asleep in the morning. I don't want to ruin your sleep unless you think we should do it," Brian suggested, wiggling his eyebrows meaningfully. Brenda's reaction was just as Brian had expected. If he hadn't heard her talking to her lover, he wouldn't have noticed her brief stare like a deer in headlights before she smiled weakly. "I'm really tired today. Why don't we just cuddle for a while and go to sleep?" Brenda replied. Besides, Tim is home tonight. He might hear us. Cuddling won't work for me, Brian replied. If you rule out sex, I'll just avoid temptation and sleep in the guest room. You've never worried about Tim hearing us before, so it's just a nonsense excuse to avoid sex. You really don't have to make up anything. I'm not the type to pressure a woman. I know that, Brian. You're right. It was pretty weak, and I'm sorry. I'm just tired and not feeling the romance. I hope you can understand me. I understand better than you think. Let me know when you're in the mood. If I'm in the mood at the same time, we can get together. Good night, Brian replied, turned and headed for the guest room, leaving Brenda with a confused look on her face. On Saturday, Brian played ball with Tim for an hour and then did yard work. When it was time to go to bed, he walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. Brenda watched him and wondered why he was acting so strangely. Brian went to work early Sunday evening to prepare for his role as shift foreman. By the time the worker started showing up, he was feeling pretty good. He didn't bother to tell Brenda that he had been promoted to foreman. She had her own secrets that she kept from him, so he no longer had any qualms about keeping things from her. His shift went smoothly. He was well received by those who worked under him. He thought he had a great team on his shift. There was more responsibility in his new position, but Brian had already faced all the problems and knew how to deal with them. He settled into his new position without too many problems. Brenda had already left for work, and the construction crew had started work when Brian arrived home Monday morning. He spoke briefly with the foreman to make sure they were on the same page and then went into the house. He fell asleep right away but was awakened several times by loud noises made by the crew working on his apartment, and once by the ringing of the phone. Cursing himself for not turning off the ringer on the landline in the guest room, Brian answered with difficulty. "Hello? I'm sorry, Brian. Did I wake you up?" his mother-in-law Beverly asked. "And that's why you called?" Brian asked with irritation. "You wanted to know if I was asleep?" "You don't have to act like that," Beverly replied. "I just wanted you to know that Bill and I heard that you have the night shift and we won't bother you. If you need us to do anything for Tim when you're asleep, just let us know." Brian hung up without answering. Unplugging the phone from the wall, he thought about how stupid people could be. A few minutes passed, but he fell asleep again. The construction crew finished the job in less than a week. Brian was surprised that the contractor completed the entire remodel in 4 days. It would have taken him 4 months. Waking up Friday afternoon, he drove to the furniture store in order to double bed, a small kitchen table, 4 chairs, and a small sofa. Then he went to an appliance store and picked out a large, flat-screen TV refrigerator oven and microwave. By Monday afternoon, his bachelor apartment was ready to be occupied full-time, Brian thought. He grinned, remembering how puzzled Brenda had been when she'd come home from work on Monday, and found a crew of men huddled around a detached garage. She'd approached Brian while he was talking to the foreman and insisted on a private conversation so he could tell her what was going on. "I plan to build an apartment over the garage," Brian says. "I want to be able to sleep for days on end without fear of someone breaking in or calling. I'll double insulate to minimize noise. There won't even be a landline phone. Since I'll be working nights for a while, I think it will be very helpful to have a place where I can sleep without stressing you and Tim out. You won't even know I'm around." "Not knowing you're around," Brenda repeated. "You're my husband and Tim's father. We need to know you're around. I'll go to Tim's baseball practices and games. I'll be bringing him home afterward, so he and I will be spending a lot of time together. Don't worry about that. We'll all be able to have dinner together. A few days ago, I asked you to let me know when you were in the mood for a special lovemaking, but you still haven't taken me up on my offer. Are you asking me to scratch your itch tonight? You're being a jerk. Husbands are expected to do more than just entertain their wives when they feel like it. We expect conversation, seduction, sharing ideas and problems. Marriage isn't just about raw sex. You know that. Don't even think about lecturing me on what a good marriage is, Brian had managed. I'll compare the effort I'm putting into this marriage to your efforts any day. It's going to be great. All you have to do is let me know when you want me in your bed and servicing you. I'm not some damn cow that needs or wants to be serviced, snapped at Brenda. You're not going to serve me until you sincerely apologize. Along with an apology, I want a nice evening at a nice restaurant, asshole. Brian smiled broadly and simply walked away, leaving Brenda completely bewildered. It had been easy for him to keep Bill Grant from demanding to have sex with him in the marital bed, but it was Brian's attitude that bothered Brenda. He just wasn't like his old self. He was ignoring Brenda, and that bothered her. He had always been a very attentive husband. She decided that she would give Brian an unforgettable night once he apologized for his rude behavior. She knew he couldn't go without sex for long. A man can't go from having sex 2 or 3 times a week to nothing and be happy. Brenda was sure he would want what she wanted. He'd been like this since they'd first met. He was too young to lose interest in sex. By next Wednesday, Brian has completely moved into his new apartment. The next weekend, Brian would have 3 days off because of Labor Day. The following Tuesday was the beginning of Tim's junior year. "How do you feel about going to a Diamondbacks game this weekend?" Brian asked over dinner Thursday. "They're playing the Dodgers and fighting for the pennant. It should be a great series." "Really? That would be awesome." "Thanks, Dad," Tim purred. "You know I'm not much of a baseball fan," Brenda grumbled. "I'm going to turn down that offer. I'll find something to do around the house." "I don't doubt it," Brian replied under his breath, but loud enough for Brenda to hear. "It's decided. Tim and I will go to Saturday's game. I can't wait to tell Scooter about this," Tim purred. "He'll be so jealous. He's a big Dodger fan. He used to live in Los Angeles." "Why don't you invite him along?" Brian suggested. "I'll call him right now." "Thanks, Dad," Tim replied excitedly and rushed to get the phone. "You definitely made Tim's day," Brenda remarked. "You definitely made Tim's day," Brenda remarked. "He's a great way to bond with the boys. Horace is a nice, polite young man." "Holy shit! His real name is Horace?" Brian asked, shaking his head. "No wonder he has a nickname like that. What kind of parents would name a boy Horace unless they hate him or something?" "Tim told me that Horace's father died of a brain aneurysm 2 years ago." Brenda continued, ignoring her husband's remark about the boy's name. "He and his mother moved here this summer to be closer to her parents. They're elderly now, and their health leaves a lot to be desired." "I'm going to call him Scooter and pretend I've never heard his real name," Steve announced, as Tim burst into the room again. Scooter's mom let him go, announced an almost jubilant Tim. "It's going to be great." On Saturday afternoon, Tim drove his truck up to a house in a nice neighborhood. Before he could stop, Scooter had already jumped out of the house. He jumped into the truck next to Tim as soon as the pickup was parked. "Mr. Welker? Mom said she wants to meet you before we leave." "I think she wants to make sure you're not a serial killer or something," Scooter offered. "I'm sorry." "No problem," Brian replied, climbed out of the truck, walked up to the house, and rang the bell. The door was opened by a slender, rather unassuming woman about Brian's age. After a quick glance at her, Brian could tell that her best feature was her legs. They were strong and perfectly built. Her jogging shorts allowed him to admire them fully. Her stomach was flat. "My legs look pretty good compared to the rest of me, don't you think?" Scooter's mom asked, much to Brian's dismay. "Yeah, sure," Brian agreed, seeing the smirk on the woman's face. "You have great legs. Do you think I should let my son go to a baseball game with a man who checks out every woman he meets?" the boy's mother asked. "I'm trying to raise a gentleman." Brian saw the laughter in the woman's eyes and instinctively realized she was teasing him a little. He decided to play along. "What you're really asking is whether it's worth letting your son go anywhere with a man, since meeting women is the best part of being a man," Brian replied with a smirk. "He needs to learn to appreciate members of the weaker sex. I'll show him what to look for and how." "I do hope you'll be less obvious during the life lessons you'll be giving Horace," the still smiling woman objected. "The first thing I'm going to teach him is to beat up anyone who calls him Horace." "Except his mom, of course," Brian joked. "I see. My son will learn to be cruel to people who address him by his first name, as well as to appreciate a woman's legs. Is that enough?" "Not even close," Brian replied. "It's important that he get a well-rounded education and not get hung up on any one feminine trait." "That's good to know," Scooter's mom replied, which made Brian respect her even more. "Have a great time and be sure to call Scooter if you're going to be late. By the way, my name is Gertrude." "Really? Gertrude? What do your friends call you?" Brian asked. "To my male friends, I'm called Minx, Raven, Candy, or Bubbles. My girlfriends call me Gertrude," the woman replied with a straight face. "I think it's pretty good. I'm Brian. We're going to be friends, so I'm going to call you Minx. I like that name." "Why am I not surprised?" Gertrude replied and burst into a hearty laugh. "Horace can go with you any time. I like your sense of humor. Tim is a very polite young man, so I was sure his parents wouldn't mind. Thanks for inviting him to the game. We're a baseball family. I went to every Dodgers home game I could. My dad even played in the minor leagues before I was born. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't good enough. Gertrude added, Scooters are great guys, so that's not a problem. I'll keep an eye on him and make sure he gets home safe and sound, Minx. Have a good day. Why could it be wrong? I was only joking, Gertrude protested. You'll always be Minx to me, Brian replied quickly and headed for the truck. Brian had a quiet day at the game. Scooter managed to catch the ball. Both boys ate too many hot dogs and drank too much soda. They fell asleep in the back seat of the truck before Brian could even drive out of the parking lot. Upon reaching Scooter's house, Brian gently woke the boy and escorted the sleepy teenager to the front door where he was greeted by a radiant Gertrude. He probably had too many hot dogs and sodas, Brian admitted. Of course he was. He was at the ball game, Gertrude replied. Thank you so much for picking him up and bringing him back safe and sound. My pleasure. Scooter's a great guy, Minx, Brian replied. I'll see you at the boys' games. Brian had established a routine that suited him well. He would come home, eat a big breakfast, and then sleep from 9 to 3. Thanks to the extra soundproofing and blackout curtains on the windows, he usually slept soundly. Brenda would periodically complain that he was always sleeping in his man cave, even on weekends. She would drop the subject as soon as Brian asked if she needed his services. Brian decided that she was really worried that Grant would insist on having sex in her bedroom and get caught. Brian was perfectly fine with that. It indicated that she was not going to ask for a divorce at this point. His goal of staying married until Tim graduated from high school seemed achievable. Since he was working as a foreman and not getting enough exercise, Brian purchased a home exercise machine that claimed to provide a total body workout. To his pleasant surprise, the machine worked as claimed, provided he used it diligently. He attended all of Tim's baseball practices, and soon the coach had him working out with a few kids on the sidelines while the coach practiced with another group of players. Tim was not a bad player and was showing signs of improvement, but Scooter was a real surprise to Brian. He showed talent early in the season, but was tentative and timid. Brian practiced with him as much as he could. They even spent a few hours on weekends practicing at a local park. Brian decided that since he wasn't having sex, he could relieve the tension by playing baseball with the boys. As Scooter's confidence grew, his level of play increased significantly. By mid-season, Scooter was playing the cleanup position and shortstop at a high level. Tim was the starting center fielder and was playing third. Brian was very proud of both boys' accomplishments. Brian couldn't help but notice that some of the kids' moms were starting to pay attention to him. For some reason, his jokes were really making them laugh. His efforts in working with the children were constantly praised. A few of the moms baked something for the team, but they always made sure he got a piece of whatever it was. Tim's friendship with Scooter and the time Brian spent with the boys naturally led to Gertrude and Brian spending time together. Brian thought she was a smart friend with a great sense of humor. He decided to ask Gertrude if she had noticed an increased interest in him from the mothers. I may not be quite right, Minx, but I have to ask you a slightly personal question, Brian began. Almost a B cup, Gertrude quickly replied. What? I don't understand, Brian admitted. When men preface a question to a lady by saying it's personal, aren't they usually going to ask her about her broad size? Well, yes, that's usually true. Brian agreed with a chuckle. In this case, I was wondering if you've noticed that some of the moms have started treating me differently in the last couple of weeks. Don't you think they've gotten a little friendlier lately? Well, aren't you Mr. Observant? Gertrude objected. You really don't know what's going on, do you? I need more information on what you're referring to before I can answer that question. Brian reflected. I understand the infield fly rule. I know you can never have the first or last out in an inning at third base, but you don't mean those baseball axioms, do you? No, I was talking about the unwritten rule of never stealing bases when you're heavily outnumbered. Gertrude picked up on that and became more serious. If you were paying attention, you'd know that the friendliest moms on the team are also single moms. You're a great dad, a good-looking guy, and have a pretty decent job. That makes you a damn good catch in their eyes, Gertrude reasoned. What about the fact that I'm a married man? Won't they take that into consideration? Brian asked. Yeah, Scooter's mom replied. That's why they didn't try to seduce you. No one's tried yet, have they? No one has ever seduced me like that was ever a problem, Brian replied. I'm married, so obviously I can't be a good catch for anyone. Brian, I don't like that I'm the one who has to tell you this, but we're friends, so it's on me. All mothers know your wife is cheating on you. That's not so bad. Rumor has it that she shut you out of sex. You don't sleep together, and it's safe to say you'll be a free agent in the not-too-distant future. These women want to sign you to their team as soon as you're free. Brian was stunned by Gertrude's revelation. How could so many people know about his personal life? Who could know about his sex life or lack thereof? And then it hit him. Brenda must have told that bastard we weren't sleeping together, and he bragged about it to someone. Do you mean your wife or her lover? Gertrude asked, trying to diffuse the situation. I must say that you don't seem very surprised by these rumors. Did you already suspect Brenda was cheating on you? No, I never suspected, Brian replied. You didn't know at all, an incredulous Gertrude asked. I knew she was cheating. I just never suspected it, Brian replied. You're losing me here. How can you know that without suspecting? It's all very simple. I didn't suspect a thing until the moment I discovered Grant entertaining Brenda in our bed. In a matter of seconds, I went from being sure she was cheating to being sure she was. I stopped being suspicious altogether. This revelation raises more questions than it answers, said his embarrassed friend. You've seen them do the horizontal mamba, yet you stay married and don't go to jail. You're not a singer, right? Or a guy who likes to watch. Please don't be one of those creeps. No, don't worry about it, Brian assured him. I decided to change my priorities. Being able to spend a lot of time with Tim and not be a part-time father became my main goal. Living with Brenda rather than divorcing her seemed like the best way to accomplish this. I started working nights, which always took a toll on our sex life. I built a nice apartment over my detached garage and lived there. I told Brenda that this way I could get enough sleep during the day so I wouldn't be pestered and annoyed by domestic problems. She wasn't thrilled with that routine, but Grant told her that every time she had sex with me, he would insist on entertaining her in our marital bed. This seemed to bother her, but not enough to stop entertaining him. She thinks her affair is a secret and wants to keep it a secret. I haven't told her this, but I won't have sex with her for any reason. I went to the clinic and got tested for STDs. I'm clean. I want to keep it that way. Are you serious? Did you hear that? That bitch. How can she treat a guy like you so badly? What a jerk that guy is, Gertrude resented. All the single moms think you'd be a great catch. I think you have an inflated opinion of my attractiveness. I've never been a matinee idol. I have a good job, so maybe this will make me look better to some of the more desperate women, Brian offered. Are you kidding? Look how handsome you are. You have a wonderful smile, Gertrude remarked. You're strong, kind, smart, and great with kids. If I wasn't so unassuming, I'd have thrown my hat in the ring by now, along with my cup bra, I think. I better shut up. Thanks for being a good enough friend to tell me what people say and think, Brian replied glumly. I didn't realize everyone knew I was a cuckold. It's rather embarrassing. I can't make my own wife happy. I'm a world-class wimp. You're a good man who wants to be a good father to your son. You're strong enough to put up with all this crap, so you have a great relationship with Tim. Horace thinks you're awesome, too. Who asked Brian? You must feel better if you can tease me with the name of Horace, Gertrude remarked with a smile. Minx, you're a great friend. You kept my head from sticking too far up my ass. I hope Tim doesn't find out about this. That Horace is either already out of the barn or damn close to it, Gertrude remarked. Horace says Tim knows things aren't all right at home. You hardly ever see his mother. He's bound to hear something when so many people know about it. You know what worries me? Gertrude added. Horace is partial to Heather Grant. How embarrassing is that for both him and me? She's a nice girl. She has no idea what a miserable freak her father is. I'm just glad Tim isn't the one sniffing around Heather, Brian stated. What a mess that would be. I should be happy about the little favors. Horace says Tim is very interested in Holly Ingram, but that shouldn't surprise you. She comes to every game and enjoys his every move, declared a smiling Gertrude. Yeah, I noticed she was around somewhere. She seems like a nice girl. I knew her dad and uncle in high school, Brian recalled. They're a nice family. 2 days later, Tim's team was playing in the first round of the district championship. As game time approached, Brian realized that he was probably more nervous than Tim. It didn't help that 3 ordinary single mothers were determined to get his attention. Norma Wilson was wearing a tank top. She was always finding reasons to bend over in front of Brian to pick something up or look for something. She constantly asked Brian questions about the team and players. Jillian Patterson was less subtle. For some reason, she had to stand fairly close to Brian. Brian noticed that all three ladies had found some reason to leave his vicinity all at the same time. It seemed strange to him until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "I decided to join my husband this afternoon to watch my son play. I didn't think I'd have to wade through so many groupies to get to him," Brenda remarked, louder than necessary. "What's going on, Brian?" "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim looked really good at practice," Brian replied, trying to brush off the question. "Nice try," Brenda snapped back. "Why do those women hover around you like flies on shit? Good thing you're not allergic to silicone. If you're asking me to explain how a woman's mind works, you're out of luck." "I have no idea," Brian admitted. "I'm even surprised you're here. My son is in an important game. I'm here to support him. Obviously, there are other mothers here. Obviously, some of them are here for more than just their children." "You've been too busy to come to the games," Brian remarked. "How did you get free from your commitments today?" Brenda glanced at her husband when he mentioned her obligations. She wondered briefly if he was hinting at something, but as soon as the thought crossed her mind, she immediately dismissed it. If he had any suspicions, he'd be much angrier and much more determined for conflict. One thing she knew about Brian: he would never put up with her cheating. If he found out, he would let her know it in the most obvious way possible. "I made the time. This game is important to Tim, which means it's important to me. I haven't seen much of you since you switched to the night shift, so I thought it would be nice to spend some time together cheering Tim on," Brenda reasoned. As Brenda and Brian sat down in the bleachers, she noticed that there were several other mothers watching her, and they didn't seem all that friendly. Brenda thought about it for a moment. What could she have done that annoyed the other mothers? This was the first game she had ever attended. She hadn't interacted with any of them, so she couldn't think of any reason to dislike them. Brenda noticed Gertrude sitting off to the side. As usual, she didn't stand out in any way, although Brenda noticed that her hair was professionally styled, and her legs looked good in her shorts, which were probably too short, especially considering the cool temperature of the day. The game started, and Brian's attention was drawn to the field of play. The first two players struck out balls before Tim came out to bat. Brenda was worried about her son when she saw how fast the first pitch went and how close to his head it went. The second pitch was low and away from Tim, but he took it confidently and threw it over first base for a double. Scooter pitched next. Brenda noticed that he looked older, stronger, and more confident than he had last summer. The first pitch flew into the catcher's mitt near Scooter's head. If he hadn't leaned back, it might have hit him. Brenda heard Brian giggle as Scooter prepared for the next pitch. "Trying to intimidate those two guys is a big mistake," Brian stated to those within earshot. "I hope the pitcher tries to sneak a fastball past Scooter." The rest of the audience nodded in agreement as the pitcher executed his pitch. He was a hard thrower, and on the next pitch he did something extra. There was a loud crack as Scooter's bat met the baseball crossing the plate. There were oohs and AAs through the stands as the ball disappeared over the center field fence. Tim ran across the court and waited for his friend to touch home plate before exchanging cheers. Gertrude watched proudly as her son walked around the base. She looked at Brian and saw tears on his cheeks. He had spent countless hours practicing fielding and batting with Tim and her son. His pleasure and pride was almost palpable. Gertrude was very grateful to Brian for mentoring her son since their arrival. Horace grew up to be a fine young man, and Brian played a huge role in building his character. Brenda drove to the pizza place to join Brian and Tim as the team celebrated the victory. She found a parking spot fairly far from the entrance. When she entered the restaurant, she saw both Norma Wilson and Brandy Doran standing too close to her husband. Brenda was not surprised when they seemed to disappear as she approached. It made her mentally replay the conversation she'd had 2 weeks ago with her lover, Bill Grant. "It's about time we did it in your bed, don't you think?" Bill prodded as Brenda dressed after the sex session. "You said you wouldn't do this in our bed until Brian and I had sex," Brenda reminded her. "I don't feel like taking any chances. Are you really telling me that you haven't had sex with your husband since the day we had fun at your house?" her incredulous lover asked. "You said I should shut him out for as long as I could, and that you wouldn't insist that I have sex in our house until he made love to me. He left for the night shift that day and has been sleeping in a room over the garage ever since. We haven't even exchanged a handshake since." "That's just crazy," Bill replied. He's too young and you're too hot for him to lose interest in sex. Is he gay? Does he have a girlfriend or something? He's definitely not gay, Brenda insisted. He's very manly. He would never cheat on me. It's just that he works nights and is tired most of the time. He only shows up for dinner except on weekends when he does the yard and other things. No normal man married to a piece of ass like you would go without, even if he worked 18 hours a day, Grant stated. He must be having fun with someone. That should make it easier for us to meet. He'll get his and I'll get what used to belong to him. Brian would never cheat on me, Brenda stated firmly. He takes our marriage vows very seriously. He's not the type to sneak around having dirty affairs. You think so? Bill asked. Well, no, it's just a temporary thing. He's been too busy with work and Tim's baseball to pay much attention to me. I deserve some fun. I work hard to keep the house and cook and work full-time, Brenda reasoned. We know it won't last. Bill smiled, mulling over Brenda's words. I guess you're right. Let's just enjoy the ride while it lasts. Give me a day when I can entertain you in your bed. Remembering Bill's words, Brenda grew concerned as she watched the two hotties circling Brian slip away. It was obvious that he was interested in damn attractive women. She realized she had to protect her marriage from the encroachment of these bitches. Then she noticed Gertrude sitting alone. Brenda quickly devised a plan. She smiled broadly and sat down next to a surprised Gertrude. It's good to see you again, Gertrude. Horace has become quite a good ball player and a very nice boy. You must be very proud of him. Yes, admitted a wary Gertrude. Tim's doing well, too. The time Brian spent with them is paying off. He's really become a great mentor for Horace. Yes, sometimes Brian is too good, Brenda replied, seeing an opportunity for her suggestion. I'm sure you've noticed that there are boobed blondes hanging around him all the time. I was wondering if you could help me out. I know that under normal circumstances, Brian would never be pranked. And how do you expect me to help you? Gertrude asked. Spray them with cold water when they get too close? You know I can't attend most games and practices because of my job and other commitments, Brenda began cautiously. I know I can trust Brian with you. You're not his type at all. If you just stick around when I'm not around, I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to tell Brian that he should stay close to you and be more attentive. Those husband-stealing bitches will think he's stopping at you and hopefully leave him alone. I know it might be embarrassing for you to pretend like this, but there's a good reason. You can save our marriage. Please let me see if I've got this right, replied an incredulous Brenda. You're afraid that these attractive, sexy, single moms might seduce Brian, so you're asking me to sort of fill in for you when he's at games and practices. You think I'm a safe single mom because I'm pretty droopy-looking? I didn't say you were boring. I just know Brian. For some reason, he's not likely to fall in love with you and not some former cheerleader. You're going to help him keep his vows. You think cheating on your spouse is a deal-breaker? Gertrude asked thoughtfully. Would it be so terrible if he hooked up with several such willing ladies just to keep you number one for him? I hope you're kidding, Brenda replied. I love my husband, but I would never tolerate cheating. It's really what you were talking about. It destroys the marriage contract. I could never condone infidelity. As far as I'm concerned, the marriage would be over. You must understand how I feel. You have been married for many years. I understand what fidelity and loyalty are. It makes sense that cheating violates the marriage contract, Gertrude admitted. I'm forced to agree. I need to stop by Brian's. Can I count on you to keep an eye on him when I'm not around? Brenda asked. Oh, yes, Gertrude replied with a smile. Be sure to explain all of this to Brian. I'll keep my end of the bargain. Who better to keep a good man celibate than a homely, boring woman? I wouldn't say that, but you made a great point. Thank you again, Brenda replied as she walked away to her husband. Last night, Brenda wanted to have a talk before I left for work. Brain began to practice the next day. The gist of the conversation was that there are too many sexy single moms hanging around me. She thinks I'd feel much safer if I stayed close to you, Minx, or as she calls you, Gertrude. Why don't I feel safe? You're a clever man. You know you'll never be safe around a single woman, said Gertrude. Minx, you're one of the most attractive women I've ever met, Brian replied sincerely. You have everything in you, not just silicone and bleach. You just made my job harder, Gertrude admitted, blushing. I'll make an appointment to have your eyes checked after baseball season is over. You'll find that I have 20/20 vision, and I'm an excellent judge of character with one glaring exception, Brian stated. I guess I misjudged my loving wife. I think she misjudged us, Minx replied. Brian was amused by the reaction of the single moms as Minx stayed close to him. He spent a lot of time chatting and joking with her. The most common reaction was disbelief, followed by disappointment. It took Minx less than one training session to separate him from the herd. For the next game, the team had to drive 3 hours to Middleburg. It was decided that the team would hit the road the day before the game and spend the night in a hotel. We hoped that the boys would be rested and fresh for the next challenge. Brian gave Jake Winston's parents a ride as well as Minx. On the way, everyone discussed the team's chances of winning the district and possibly the state title. They arrived at the hotel right behind the team bus. Brian helped Ralph Winston get the luggage out of the trunk. Some parents, including the Winstons, volunteered to accompany the boys and would stay at the same hotel. All other parents had to make reservations at different hotels. Since there were several games being played the next day, many fans and players gathered in town. 6 teams from schools of different grades would compete in 3 games. Before Tim climbed on the bus, Brian told him that he would not be staying in the same hotel and should behave himself with the coaches and chaperones. He assured his son that he would be at the team's practice the next morning. "What hotel are you staying at, Minx?" Brian asked as the Winstons rolled their bags to the command hotel. "In the same hotel as you," she replied simply. "I never told you which hotel I was using." "How did you know?" a perplexed Brian asked. "I didn't do it," was the court reply. "How do you know we're in the same hotel? It's really crowded this weekend. You might not be able to get a room at the last minute," Brian remarked. "I'm sure something will come up," Gertrude replied with a wide grin, which confused Brian even more. Brian pulled up to the hotel a few minutes later and asked Gertrude, "Minx, do you want to see if you can get a room while I check in? I can wait to see if you're onto something. Thanks, but I'll wait here." "I'll be fine," she insisted. As he checked in and picked up his room access cards, Brian finally began to have an epiphany. When he got back to his truck, he found Minx waiting. "Perhaps you'd like to get one of these cards for my room," he asked. "It's room 207. "What a thoughtful gesture," Minx exclaimed as she got out of the car, accepting the keys and kissing Brian on the cheek. "Let's get to bed. It's going to be a long night." Brian got up the next morning much more tired than when he went to bed. At first, he mentally wrestled with the reality of breaking his marriage vows, but Minx helped him through it. "Let's look at this logically. Brenda not only cheated on you, but she agreed to turn you off sexually. Even if she hadn't, she would still be putting your health at risk by having unprotected sex with a damn kitten. In essence, she made sexual relations with her both unsafe and unwanted. She freed you from your vows and your prenup. I haven't had sex in over 2 years. I've been tested and I'm clean. You got tested after you found out she was a cheating whore and you're clean? I went on the pill over a month ago hoping to meet you. Can you honestly give me one single reason why we shouldn't sleep together? Is it because of my looks? Your wife thought I was perfect for all the beauties who showed interest in you because she knew you would never be sexually attracted to me. Am I just not desirable? Minx, you are very desirable. Don't ever think you aren't. I've never cheated on Brenda, and it takes some getting used to, but you've made a great argument for us being together." "I'm ready," Brian said with a smirk. "There's something else you need to know first," Minx replied. "Both of my parents are in hospice care and by the looks of it won't live much longer. My brother sends movies of Horace's games to a friend of his. That friend is the baseball coach at the best prep school in the Los Angeles area. If Horace gets a baseball scholarship for next year, we'll probably move back. I like you a lot, but we don't expect to be in a long-term relationship. It can't last. Look at us. You're a handsome married man with a cheating wife. I'm plain Jane with a son who has a shot at an athletic scholarship to a good university. I have to do what's best for Horace," she concluded. "Good to hear about Scooter," Brian proudly stated. "He's a good kid and a very talented player. I'm glad he'll get a chance to hone his skills against tough opponents and get a good education at the same time. You're the main reason top schools are paying attention to him. I know how much time and work you spend with him. It's ironic that the fact that you have been such a good mentor for my son has actually given us the opportunity to move back to LA and away from you." "I don't think I'm going to do well in terms of one-night sex," Brian worried. Maybe I'd rather give up sex altogether than have one-night stands and become a monk again. You stupid man. I said we'll probably move to LA for the next school year. That's more than 6 months from now. A guy can have a lot of fun in 6 months unless he's too old. That is something we have yet to find out. Do you live up to your nickname, Minx? Brian joked. I'll do it for you, big boy, Minx promised. When you want to see me, just whistle and I'll teach you how to whistle. I've always been told my whistling is pretty decent. Brian picked up on that. Then you're doing it wrong, Gertrude objected. The baseball team won a state championship and Scooter received a scholarship to a prestigious California prep school. Both of Gertrude's parents passed away just before Thanksgiving within a week of each other. Brian and Tim attended their funeral. Brian met Gertrude's brother and liked him immediately. Brian, meet my brother Dexter, Gertrude introduced. Dexter, this is Horace's baseball mentor and our good friend Brian. Holy shit, Brian exclaimed. Your name is Dexter? Right, Gertrude's brother agreed. Only Gertrude and my folks call me Dexter. Everyone else calls me Grim. What do you call my sister? I call her Minx, but don't ask me why, Brian insisted. I don't think I need to ask, Grim replied with a laugh. Brian spent Thanksgiving with Brenda and Tim at her parents' house. For the first time in months, Brian found himself getting ready for bed with Brenda. They had always stayed overnight on Thanksgiving, and Brian couldn't think of a decent excuse to change that tradition. Brenda took her time removing her clothes in front of Brian. We haven't slept together in a long time, Brenda Q.U.D. You must be in need of love by now. Make love to me. Brian felt awkward about his next comment, even as he replied. You finally admit you need to be properly serviced? I knew you'd break. You miserable bastard. You won't get anything for years to come with that kind of behavior, growled Brenda. What's the matter with you? You can forget that I never even thought of letting you touch me. Okay, was all Brian replied, rolling over so that he was with his back to Brenda. He didn't ponder his comment, even though it was out of character. At least he had accomplished his goal of avoiding sex with Brenda. However, Brian regretted that his marriage had gotten to this state. Brenda was bothered by Brian's snide comment that kept her awake. Lying next to him, she wondered if he knew about her affair or if he was just sorry they hadn't had sex lately. She decided that she would be sure to discuss it with Bill. He should forget about having sex with Brenda in her marital bed if she was having sex with Brian. This statement made her avoid and deny her husband, which could eventually make him suspicious. It could ruin her marriage. When Brian worked the night shift, he had a certain routine. He would come home, eat a small breakfast, and go to bed by 9 in the morning. He was often awakened around 2 in the afternoon by Minx climbing naked into his bed. They would make love for an hour, after which she would leave to be home when Scooter got home from school. Baseball was over for the season. This allowed Brian to shower and shave when Tim got home from school. Brian often had time for a nap in the evening before he went to work. All in all, Brian and Minx were having a good time. One evening in early December, Brian received a call from Tim shortly after coming to work. Dad, Scooter, and I, and Heather and Holly are walking in Heather's car. You said we could walk until midnight because there's no school tomorrow. We have a problem. Heather was driving Mom's car. We have a flat tire and no spare in the trunk. We're stuck on D Street, and I'm a little worried. I see some guys outside the arcade looking that way. You broke down on goddamn D Street? At the damned arcade, Brian scolded. We'll discuss that later. Is Heather driving that Corolla? Yes, it's a 2017 Corolla, Tim quickly replied. I'll find a suitable wheel and tire and come right over. Keep the doors locked and call the police if there's any trouble. Keep those girls safe. Brian dropped the phone in his pocket and headed for the production floor. He quickly found the person he needed. Gus, you still drive a Corolla, don't you? Brian asked the bearded man operating the forklift. I need a tire that fits your car and right now. While Brian was talking to Gus, another thought occurred to him. Jack Reynolds was walking by. Jack was Holly's uncle. His younger sister was Holly's mother. Jack, my son, and his friends are stuck on D Street with a flat tire and no spare tire. Holly's with them. I'll get a tire from Gus and go over there. I'd appreciate it if you'd come with me. I have a real spare tire, not some goddamn donut, Gus declared. Let's take my car and go there right now. Jack, Gus, and Brian immediately headed for the door to the parking lot. They were concerned about the kids being in this part of town late at night. This was no place for good kids, especially teenage girls. Brenda lay in bed, basking in the warm glow she always felt after libations with Bill. The phone rang and he glanced at the caller ID. Damn it, it's Heather. I have to answer it or she'll be bugging me for ignoring her. Brenda could only hear one side of the conversation, but was concerned that she had overheard. What the hell are you kids doing in there? That's too bad. Those boys are old enough to handle a little problem like that. Call 555. It's not my fault your mother is too stupid to keep a spare tire in the car. What was that? Brenda asked as soon as Bill disconnected the call. No, nothing to worry about, Bill replied. Several young guys were hanging around Heather's car when Brian and his friends stopped right behind her. Brian quickly got out of the car and retrieved a jack and tire iron from Gus's trunk. Gus brought the spare tire and Jack tapped on the driver's side window and asked Heather to lower it so he could talk to her. Sit tight until we change the tire. If these assholes make any trouble, we'll deal with them. Holly, you'll be explaining to your mother why you ended up on D Street in the first place. Brian moved the jack behind the flat rear tire and slipped it under the frame. He cranked the jack until it rested against the frame, then moved to the tire to loosen the lug nuts. The apparent leader of the group of tough guys approached Jack while Brian worked on the tire. You're on our property. You need my permission before you mess around with this car. Before Jack could respond, Brian jerked the tire iron around and kicked the guy in both shins. The man fell to his knees and then rolled on the ground, rubbing his shins and cursing the blue streak. Brian grabbed the brat by the collar and dragged him face down to lie down next to the flat tire. Then he sat down on the man's back and continued unscrewing the nuts. The two closest gang members rushed toward him, clearly intent on pulling Brian away from their incapacitated leader. Jack kicked the first of them in the head and he fell to the ground. When Gus stepped forward, the second guy stepped back out of his reach. Lift the car up a little and I'll take the tire out, Brian told Jack in a calm voice. Jack kept revving up the car as the gang of toughs shouted insults and curses at the men. Every now and then the guy under Brian would try to twist out from under him, but Brian would grab him by the greasy hair, lift his head a few inches, and roughly press him back into the pavement. It only took 2 lessons before the man on the ground decided not to move. Brian unscrewed the nuts and removed the tire. He accepted a good tire from Gus and reinstalled it. Once all the lugs were tightened, Jack lowered the car. All 3 men seemed oblivious to the thugs who taunted them as they worked. Brian tightened the nuts and stood up. He accidentally kicked the leader in the balls as he stepped over him. "Are you stupid bastards talking to us?" Brian asked, striding toward the gathered gang members and tossing the tire iron carelessly from hand to hand. As soon as he headed toward them, the group scattered. "Kids, get out of here," Jack ordered, as Brian drove the gang away from the car. "Be careful not to run over those stupid bastards lying in the street and stay out of this part of town." The 3 men got into Gus's car and followed Heather as she reached the next intersection and turned toward the orphanage. "I can't believe you kicked that dumb bastard in the shin like that." Gus laughed. He went down like a sack of shit. "Thanks for inviting me along," Jack added. My arm hurt, but it felt good to crack that brat over the head. "And then you sat on that asshole while you changed the tire," cackled Gus. That was fun to watch. The men were still laughing and talking about their experiences when they returned to their workplaces. By morning, the story had traveled all over the plant. Stories of courage and adventure were always popular, especially on the night shift. They helped to pass the night more quickly and provided a distraction from fatigue and sleepiness. The next day, when Brian woke up, Minx jumped into bed with him and kissed him hard and tight. She was naked and clearly hungry for him. "Horace told me what happened last night. You were great. Thank you for taking such good care of the kids," Minx marveled. "You'll still be very lucky. I would have gotten here sooner, but I had to wait for Horace and Tim to visit the girls since they don't have school today." Brenda had only been at work for an hour when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler. It was obvious that she wanted to talk about something. I heard Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson slapping some would-be tough guys who were swarming around a kid's car on D Street. I understand that being hit in the shin with a tire iron quickly knocks the starch out of punks. Brenda put it all together at once. Heather had called her father last night looking for help, but he had brushed her off. Apparently her problem was more serious than Bill recognized. Sue had used the word children, so that probably meant that Holly was involved as well as Horace and her son Tim. "I'm interested in what you've heard," Brenda replied. "I'd like to know how close the rumors are to the truth." By the time Sue had finished telling her what the rumors said, Brenda was furious with Bill Grant, even though he had hidden that fact from Sue. His daughter had gone to him for help with a situation that could have been disastrous, and Bill had simply brushed off her concerns. Brian, as well as Gus and Holly's Uncle Jack, reacted as men should. They protected the children and helped them out of a bad situation. Bill ignored his daughter's distress, preferring to have sex with Brenda. The realization that she was having sex with a man who refused to help her own daughter and some of her friends, including Tim, hurt her deeply. How low had she sunk? Brian was 10 times better than Bill. The saddest part was that Brenda had known it all along. Why had she ever gotten involved with that selfish, pompous ass? Early that morning, Brenda caught Bill in the break room where he was having a snack while his truck was being serviced. Wasting no time, she pounced on him. "Heather called you for help last night and you brushed her off. Those kids could have been in great danger and you told her to call 555. What kind of father are you? It's all worked out." Bill answered readily. "Your husband and his buddies saved the day, so what's the problem? Brian did what a real man would do. You turned your back on your daughter. That's the problem. My son was in that car. If your douchebag husband is so special, how come I'm the one screwing with your brains and he hasn't been screwed in months?" Bill asked with a chuckle. "All the superhero stuff in the world won't make his pencil as big as mine. You miserable bastard. Being a man has nothing to do with the size of a pencil," Brenda spat. "He's the kind of man you'll never be." "The way I see it, I beat that wooze in everything that matters," Bill replied and sipped another soda. "That's it," Brenda announced. "We're done with. Don't ever try to talk to me again. I want nothing to do with you." "Never mind," Bill replied calmly. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me. I'll still entertain you if you ask nicely." Brenda burst into tears and ran out of the room. She had cheated on her husband, disrespected him, risked her marriage and family for a petty, selfish sociopath. She only hoped Brian would never find out how stupid she had been. With that thought, she realized that she had a lot to make up for. Minx had just brought Brian to a strong climax when she heard sniffling behind her. Surprised, Minx turned around and saw Brenda looking at her with tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you do this to me?" Brenda cried. "I trusted both of you and you do this?" "I'm just honoring your request," Minx replied, reaching for her clothes and putting a finger to Brian's lips to silence him. "You wanted me to stop those blondes from sinking their claws into Brian? I sacrificed my body to accomplish your goals. I didn't want you to sleep with him, and you know it," Brenda replied as her anger began to be replaced by tears. "I can't believe Brian could cheat on me like that, and especially with some skinny bitch. I realized it's not easy to find out that Brian and I hit it off, but that's no reason to be insulting." Minx reasoned. "Your poor husband was about to explode. I'm just helping him release the tension. Bill Grant didn't want you to have sex with your husband, so Brian had to turn to someone. Fortunately, I was in the right place at the right time. You can thank me for helping you completely turn Brian off and making Bill happy." "Where's Bill? Is he in your bed?" "You know about Bill?" Brenda exclaimed. "Well, yes," replied Minx. "I think almost the whole free world knows about Bill. You've been sleeping with him for months. He promised you that he would entertain you in the marital bed every time you had sex with Brian, so you stopped having sex with your own husband. Fortunately, Bill was able to fill that void, if I'm not mistaken. If Brian knew, why didn't he say anything? Why did he let Bill and I continue our relationship for so long?" Brenda asks, and tears drip from her cheeks. "You're a smart girl." How would most men act if they found out their wife was a cheating whore? He would have gotten really angry and yelled at me. And then he'd probably divorce me, Brenda added, as the reality of the situation became more apparent. "Sounds about right. What's going to happen next? Brian and Tim stay here and you move in with Bill?" Minx asked quietly. "I wouldn't leave my home, and I wouldn't give up Tim either. If Brian wanted a divorce, he'd have to move out. He'd pay child support and alimony. Tim would stay with me," Brenda concluded. "That's exactly what Brian thought would happen," Minx agreed. "Suppose staying close to Tim and being the best father possible is his first goal. How would he accomplish that goal? Not by divorcing me." Brenda replied quietly. He stayed around for Tim's sake, not mine. He found out about Bill and me and basically divorced me, just not legally. We've been living as a divorced couple for months now, haven't we? I was just too stupid to realize it. In my defense, I'm just a skinny bitch who showed up after you messed up. I helped Brian heal. I told Bill that it's over between us. I never want to see him again, Brenda declared. And this is after he refused to help his daughter out of a bad situation last night? You had no choice, did you? Minx asked rhetorically. Even cheaters have certain expectations and limitations. Are you and Brian going to live together now? Brenda asked, wiping the remnants of tears from her eyes. Honestly, we're pretty happy with what we have. Horace and I will be moving back to Los Angeles before school starts in the fall, Minx revealed. I'd rather he not know that his mom is having fun with his best friend's dad if you can do that. When it's time for me to leave, I'll probably help Brian pick a new partner if he'll let me. As you can see, I didn't steal your husband like those other moms hoped. We are temporarily enjoying each other's company like you and Shithead did. What if I don't let this go on? He's my husband. You have no right to sleep with him, Brenda insisted. You gave me that right as soon as you decided to spread your legs in front of Bill Grant, Minx replied. That pretty much freed Brian from any obligation he might have had to you. He and I have an exclusive relationship. We can trust each other if you can imagine such a thing. Brian was told he can't have sex with you or anyone else if he wants me to stick around, Minx added. Who knows what other horrors Bill Grant has slept with or what diseases he might have. Brenda burst into tears again, pondering the statement of the woman she knew as Gertrude. Could Bill have had sex with someone else on the side? Of course he could. Brenda no longer had any illusions about the kind of man Bill Grant was. She needed to get tested as soon as possible. What's going to happen now? Brenda asked apprehensively. Let's just go on like we used to. I'll go in and wake Brian up as often as I can. You'll work late and avoid him as often as you can. I think everything will work just fine. If nothing's broken, you don't have to fix it, Minx replied. I'm not going to do that, Brenda stated emphatically. You're leaving in a few months. I'm going to stay here and show Brian what a wonderful wife I can be. He won't need your skinny ass. Except he knows that my skinny ass is loyal to him, and your round ass is out there waiting to be stroked by whoever comes along, Minx objected. Basically, I control your sex life, or at least your sex life with Brian. I will not allow him anywhere near your disgusting cesspool as long as he is in a relationship with me. I don't want to risk getting sick, and he's not thrilled about it either. One thing I realized, albeit too late, is that there is so much more to a relationship than sex, Brenda stated with false bravado. In fact, sex without love and commitment is quite degrading. I'll do what a wife should happily do for her husband, and you'll just give him sex. Think about it. Okay, Minx replied. I've already thought about it. Let's do it this way. You cook a great lasagna and meatloaf for the guy. Make sure the toilets are clean and launder the marks from his boxers. We'll see who's happier. Brian, I have to tell you how ashamed and sorry I am for being so disrespectful to you. Will you ever be able to forgive me? Brenda pleaded. How can he trust you again? Minx asked. He might forgive you someday, but how the hell are you going to regain his trust? That's always been an obstacle deceivers have faced. I suggest you try to enjoy the next few months while you're still Brian's wife, at least nominally. Realize what you threw away for kinky sex and learn from it. Brian doesn't want to break up the family while Tim is in school. You'll have about 9 months after I leave to do everything you can to get him back. When Tim graduates, Brian will probably throw your ass to the curb, Minx predicted. Brian, why are you letting her speak for you? Brenda demanded. I'm not just his lover, I'm his best friend, Minx replied. While you were whispering sweet nothings in Bill's ear, Brian and I were talking into a pillow. I promised to deal with this very situation if and when it finally arose. Any promise to screw my